On April 19, 1989, the USS Iowa, a veteran of the greatest conflict in human history, experienced an unprecedented event during a military exercise in the Caribbean. One of its turrets, without any warning, simply exploded, ending the lives of 47 sailors. This event is now remembered as the USS Iowa tragedy. But why did a ship that had been in operation for decades simply fail? Was it the fault of those involved? And why was it believed that the cause was the sexuality of one of the gunners? To understand the reason behind such a terrible event, we need to look at some pivotal decisions that were made during the development of the ship. The Iowa was born at the end of the 1930s, a time when the Empire of Japan reigned over East and Southwest Asia. The United States had foreseen a war with Japan since 1890 and had been preparing for it since 1929 with the so-called War Plan Orange. However, in 60 Years' War did not seem as imminent as it did in the prelude to World War II. The Americans would begin building battleships with specific features to face Japan in the late 1930s. The Iowa class had a top speed of 33 knots when fully loaded. The turrets, although not the most powerful of the time, were more than enough to defeat any ship. Each Iowa had 9 16-inch naval guns distributed in 3 turrets, with each gun able to fire independently. Of course, each turret could withstand calibers thanks to its armor. If we look at the size of the turrets, it's actually larger than what we can see at first glance. Since the whole structure extended more than 5 levels below the ship's deck, with the lower part being the magazine and the upper part being the loading and firing zone. In the lower part, each powder container is loaded and lifted by elevators as well as the projectile. To reload the cannon, it is aligned with the loading cradle at 5 degrees of elevation, and then the projectile is brought into position, which is pushed in by the rammer. Then come the powder charges, which are 6, and they must be loaded, 3 at a time. Afterwards, the chamber is closed and the cannon is fired. Interestingly, the rammer was not automatic. The operator had to operate it manually. And during the process, you had to make sure not to push the powder bags in too far, because if they were packed too tightly, an overrun would occur when the tightly packed bags detonated. The pressure in a smaller space could cause the cannon to give way violently, so it was a process that required precision. Remember this procedure because it will be extremely important later on. The Iowa, in particular, took just 2 years to build and was launched on August 27, 1942. Participating in countless battles in the Atlantic and the Pacific, with its role in the surrender of Japan standing out. After World War II, the USS Iowa took part in the Korean War, destroying logistical posts and defensive positions. From the safety of the sea until at the end of this conflict, it was placed in reserve and basically only served for training and NATO military exercises, and it remained that way for 30 years. Since it never stopped being used, its maintenance was always carried out without fail, and there were no incidents before the tragedy of 1980. In that year, due to the rise of the Soviet Navy, the United States decided to bring its Iowa-class battleships back to life. 4 of them, including the USS Iowa, were modernized with anti-aircraft missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, as well as modern anti-aircraft systems. All the ship's electronics were upgraded to use state-of-the-art radars and technology. In 1986, it underwent a major inspection and assessment after its modernization, yielding truly discouraging results. The ship was leaking hydraulic fluid everywhere inside the turrets, and it also had serious problems with the engines. However, instead of giving up, the US Navy decided to put the USS Iowa into service anyway and repair the faults while it was in service. In May 1988, Captain Brett Musali took command of the Iowa. According to investigations before the disaster, Musali cancelled vital repairs on the turrets worth $111.4 million to divert that capital to repairs of the power plant, which he said were more vital. In subsequent military exercises between May 1988 and the day of the disaster, Musali, being aware of the condition of the turrets, would order the Iowa's guns to be used sparingly, knowing that they had quite a few known faults and it was dangerous to use them. On April 13, 1989, the ship would leave Puerto Rico for another routine exercise, not knowing that it would be one of the most fateful days in the history of the US Navy. The exercise was called Fleetec 289 and was held 330 miles northwest of Puerto Rico. The weather was clear and it was a beautiful day for firing artillery. The artillery exercise was scheduled for April 19th, so by the 18th, all the turret crews were preparing their guns for the exercise. Part of the procedure was to clean the guns with compressed air, a process for which each gun has its own individual system. Unfortunately, the compressed air system of the gun in Turret 2 was not working. This was a problem because Turret 2 was supposed to participate in a firing experiment to improve the efficiency of the guns. Meanwhile, Turret Officer Michael Skelly and Fire Control Officer Lieutenant Leo Waltz would meet with several ship leaders to establish the details of the exercise. At that meeting, the aforementioned experiment would be announced, and interestingly, Musali would not attend this meeting. This experiment, in theory, would make the Iowa have the most powerful guns in the entire Navy by firing shells with greater power. They wanted to use D8 146 powder, a more powerful gunpowder that dated back to World War II. The gunpowder couldn't be used with heavy 2,700-pound shells as it caused overloading. Cañón y podía hacerlo estallar. In fact, the powder packages said exactly that. Do not use with 2,700-pound shells. The solution they came up with was to use a special 2,700-pound shell that caused less friction, hoping it could exit the barrel more easily. And instead of using 6 powder charges, they used 5, which was extremely negligent, since those tests couldn't be done directly in the barrel, but rather in a laboratory. The crew, although trained, had little experience on the ship. Let's remember that this ship was from World War II, and the experienced operators had already retired decades ago. On the morning of April 19, 1989, the Iowa was ready to participate in the exercise. All the guns were aimed to starboard. Turret 1 fired its shells at 9:33 a.m. with the left gun failing, but without any incidents. At 9:35 a.m. the order was given for Turret 2 to fire a free gun salvo. The gun captain, Richard Lawrence, reported that the center gun was experiencing a malfunction. Shortly after, over the intercom, Lawrence was heard shouting, "The gunpowder is burning!" A few seconds later, the gun simply exploded. A huge 1,600-degree fireball emanated from the center of the turret. The fire spread through all 3 gun rooms. The explosion reached 47 crew members. All of them died, while 12 lucky ones who were in the powder magazine managed to escape with minimal injuries thanks to the ship's armored doors that protected them. The fire was monstrous. The firefighting teams didn't hold back and sprayed the entire turret and its compartments with all the water they could. The damage was total and the ship almost sank. The bodies were recovered and handed over on April 24th. Many were not properly identified, so many families buried the wrong bodies.
The captain of the Iowa stated that the Navy gave him a crew of addicts, outcasts, and other low-class sailors. According to a published report, the captain's complaints reached the office where the explosion in the turret last April was being investigated.
The investigation started immediately that same day, and well, we know we're talking about the United States. So, at first, the investigation was a bit absurd. The investigation was delegated to a Navy investigation team led by the Commodore Richard D. Milligan. Interrogaron a todos los tripulantes de interés después de semanas. Interrogations. All the testimonies pointed to the dangerous Navy experiment. But the investigators insisted that the explosion had been a deliberate act. They focused on the sailor Clayton Hardwick, who was in charge of supervising the operation of the central cannon. The investigators theorized that Hardwick was an unstable man who had placed an electronic ignition device between the powder bags to commit suicide and kill his crewmates to cover up his apparent homosexuality. After an alleged failed romantic relationship with another sailor, Kendall Truitt. Subsequently, The investigation was handed over to NIST, who for months interrogated the families of Truitt and Hardwick in a threatening manner to get them to confess their supposed sexual orientation and use it as definitive evidence. In addition, they rigged a forensic investigation so that it would conclude that a homemade explosive was used in it. That theory was leaked and the media quickly spread it. On August 11, 1989, just 3.5 months after the Navy incident, the Iowa was put back into service and the use of its guns was approved. All of this caused a lot of outrage among both the crew of the Iowa and the families of the fallen sailors. All of this because, according to the investigation by the US Navy, there was nothing wrong with the guns and everything was caused por problemas by the US Navy. There was Senators Howard Metzetbaum and John Glenn, motivated by public discontent and concerned about the Navy's incredible conclusion. They held a meeting to question the investigation, the NIS investigation. The Sandia Lab was tasked with studying the case again, and this time scientifically, yielding impressive results. It was discovered that the explosion was only possible due to overrun. Apparently, the powder bags were pushed by the rammer 3 inches further than what the cannon specifications stipulated, packing the powder much more tightly inside the chamber. Sandia Laboratory determined that the explosion was only possible in this way. Thanks to this scientific research, it was determined that the cause did not necessarily have to be a homemade ignition device, but rather it could have been due to the improper operation of the cannon. A scenario that seemed to fit very well with the stress and urgency the crew of Turret 2 was experiencing during the drill. In the end, the Navy admitted that its investigation was flawed, but in any case, there was no way to discover the exact cause of the explosion, leaving the case without a definitive conclusion. And no one was convicted for the incident. And shortly after, the USS Iowa was retired from service altogether, sealing its forward turret so it could never be used again. And today it's a museum ship in Los Angeles, which you can visit if you're ever in that city. If you like this video, you might be interested in learning about the American concrete battleship. Thanks for watching this one, and goodbye.